Welcome back, folks. This is video lecture on chapter 11, part B. We continue our journey through the glands of the body, focusing now on the thyroid in particular, and then we'll go on to talk about cortisol and its involvement in a response to stress, as well as discuss how growth hormone impacts the body. And finally, we'll stop at how calcium is involved in bone homeostasis. In these sections, the student should focus on patterns. Are there any patterns which are common, which continue from the first half of the chapter? Once you get to learn the patterns, and they're pretty linear in most cases, once you get to learn the patterns, it makes the understanding of the entire chapter very, very straightforward. The anatomical location of the thyroid gland is given in this figure, 1121A. And you can see the thyroid is not the white structure, the gray structure. The thyroid is actually the pink structure. And you can see it's nested in front of the trachea with lobes going either side and just below your common carotid arteries. Upon low-level magnification, one can see that it has a strange architecture. So the cells are actually here. The nuclei of the cells are stained dark pink, and the cytoplasm around them is stained a slightly lighter pink. But in between them are these huge masses of fluid, which is known as colloid, and the whole structure is known as a follicle. So these are thymic follicles. If we zoom in to one section of a follicle and look at the wall, we'll see that the colloid fluid is in pink and the cytoplasm of the follicular cell is in brown. This is perhaps the most important cartoon in this section because it gives us the general movement of the most important components when it comes to the generation of T3 and T4 and their release into the circulation by these follicular cells. Before we get into the chemistry, let's just look at the cell biology. So the surface of these cells is in direct contact with the extracellular fluid, which then leads to a capillary nearby. The other side of these cells, we have these undulations. And the purpose of these undulations, of course, now we know, is to increase the surface area in contact with the colloid. So these are microfolds, microvilli. Second important component is the localization of various transporters, both of the active class and the passive class, and their job is to move the chemistry in the appropriate directions, of course. Next, these cells perform endocytosis from the colloid fluid, therefore pinching off and drinking this fluid constantly, even though you may consider that as penocytosis, is actually phagocytosis because of the size of what the chemistry that's being consumed by this cell entails. And of course, there are plenty of tight junctions preventing the flow of in either type of fluid across these cells. Moving over to the chemical component, let's have a trip. Let's start here in the extracellular fluid and take a journey in first into the colloid fluid, and then we'll take a journey back towards the blood vessel. Our journey begins with a diet. In the diet, we have to have a supply of iodine. Without that, we will develop disease and lead to possible death. So once the iodide is in the bloodstream, it leaves and enters the extracellular fluid. Now I'm using my words carefully because iodide is exactly what exists in the extracellular fluid. It's the charged form of iodine. The iodide is moved into the cell by co-transport with sodium using secondary active transport. So these proteins are actually symports. Once the iodide is inside the cytosol, it then has to be moved across into the colloid fluid. And that's done by proteins that have names. They're called pendrins. These transporters, they use chloride rather than sodium, but they do move the iodide into this space. And once it enters the colloid, the iodide is converted to iodine through a very complex set of chemical reactions that we don't need to know about. But eventually it is attached to a protein called thyroglobulin, indicated here in pink. We do know that one of these enzymes is called thyroid peroxidase, and that's the one that converts the iodide into iodine. So remember one enzyme, please. Now, the manufacture of the hormone itself is pretty complex. There are a couple of entities to consider. The base is the amino acid tyrosine. So tyrosine residues of the protein are attached with iodine. A tyrosine with a single iodine is considered to be MIT, and a tyrosine with two iodines is considered to be a DIT. What's the difference? Well, M stands for mono and D stands for di. Simple prefixes. What does the IT stand for? Iodotyrosine. Therefore, we can have monoiodotyrosine or diiodotyrosine. The next step in the sequence of the hormone is to combine two of these molecules together. So each of the hormones has a base of DIT. And then what goes on to that? It could be either another DIT or just an MIT. If it's MIT, the total number of iodines is 3. So we call that T3 for tyrosine 3 iodides. And if we have 4, that's called T4. These hormones attached to the thyroglobulin can be maintained in the colloid fluid indefinitely for at least 2 months worth of supply for the body. When need requires, through endocytosis, phagocytosis, the fluid is absorbed into the cell and it forms a vesicle. And the vesicle then gets attacked by different enzymes, liberating the T3 and T4 from the thyroglobulin backbone. And the thyroglobulin is recycled, whereas the T3 and T4 are steroid hormones, and they can simply leave through the membrane and enter the extracellular fluid, and from there enter the capillaries. The signal influencing the release of T3 and T4, that signal comes in from the pituitary, the anterior pituitary. That relationship is given by figure 1123. You have the classic negative long loop feedback that we discussed when we were talking about the pituitary. The neural signals activate this 3-domino sequence, which then self-regulates. Try to figure yourself through this in association with what you learned from the pituitary, and then see how the pituitary interacts with the thyroid. Now we know how thyroid hormone is made and then released under certain conditions. Let's look at its actions. So once these two hormones, T3 and T4, enter the bloodstream, they can then travel to their target cells. Upon arrival, they stimulate these cells to absorb carbohydrate from cells in the vicinity of the small intestine. However, the same hormone has a different effect on other cells. For instance, for adipocytes, fat cells, increases the fatty acid release from these. Overall effect of T3 on the body is to increase the utilization of foods for energy production. So that's known as a calorigenic action, and that can then generate as a byproduct a significant amount of heat that then has to be eliminated from the body. And that we'll talk about that when we look at the section on temperature homeostasis. But we do know now how the direct action of T3 takes place. So T3 stimulates ATP consumption by the sodium potassium pumps at a high rate. And if you recall your cell biology, ATP generation is normally the product of either glycolysis or, more importantly, through oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. We mentioned at the beginning of the chapter about permissive actions of hormones. Well, thyroid hormone, T3, has a permissive action on the catecholamines that exist in the circulation. So an example is given here. So T3 upregulates the beta adrenergic receptors in various tissues, including the heart and the nervous system. T3 has additional effects on growth and development. Growth takes place at various points in the human life cycle, and T3 is responsible for the liberation of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Its effect on development can be seen at many levels, including something that we're familiar with from the chapter on neurons, their myelination and their growth through growth cones to their destination, and the formation of dendrites and axons along these cells. Figure 1124 shows a patient with a very advanced stage of goiter. Goiter is an overexpansion of the tissue of the thyroid. It is the result of a lack of iodine in the diet and can usually be reversed by supplying that missing ingredient. Let's move across and look at stress. Stress is interpreted by different people to be different things. Physiologists have their own perspectives too, but in the broadest agreement, in the broadest sense, it's considered by many to be interpreted in this fashion. That is, a perceived threat to homeostasis. So stress can come in many forms, including physical trauma or the result of exposure to cold. And you can see the list goes on to talk about heavy exercise, infection, decreased oxygen supply, sleep deprivation, and of course, the last one is curious because we still don't know much about it, but it seems that emotional stresses can also have the same outcome as physiological stresses. Irrespective of the underlying cause of the stress, the body reacts to stress in a simple manner. It increases the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal gland is the primary focus of all this stress, and its responsibility is to protect the body from whatever the cause of the stress is. Once again, we have a long loop negative feedback mechanism taking place with respect to this pathway. So corticotropic releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus. That then has an impact on the pituitary releasing ACTH, and the ACTH then instructs the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Please become familiar with these flowcharts in this chapter. Most of the actions of cortisol are permissive. They permit epinephrine and norepinephrine to have a greater effect on smooth muscles, especially those surrounding blood vessels, therefore controlling blood pressure. In the early days of physiological investigation, scientists that were studying cortisol referred to it as glucocorticoid because it controlled the amount of glucose in the blood. And that's its main purpose. It wants to keep glucose in the blood system so that it can be used to deal with the stress. Inflammation can also lead to stress. So it's no surprise that cortisol comes in after the inflammatory response to dampen it down. So it decreases the events associated with inflammation. That's heat, redness, swelling, and pain. Incidentally, cortisol from the mother and that produced by the fetus are important in fetal development. Table 11.2 reiterates what we just spoke about over the last few slides. So take your time, make sure you understand this table. Since cortisol is made by the adrenal gland, if there's something wrong in the production of cortisol, then the primary focus of our investigation is the adrenal gland. But regardless, because in most cases it's the adrenal gland that's at fault, we call that adrenal insufficiency. So that's to do with lower levels of cortisol measured in the blood. So patients that have adrenal insufficiency, and that would include the manifestation of weakness, fatigue, loss of appetite, and loss of weight. The importance of cortisol on the effects of epinephrine are illustrated in patients that have adrenal insufficiency. The lack of cortisol and its permissive effects on epinephrine lead to low blood pressure, and that can make the patient feel dizzy or weak or even faint. And at the same time, they may have lower blood sugar, especially between meals. If the lack of cortisol lies with the adrenal gland, we consider that as primary adrenal insufficiency. And that normally involves the loss of the cells in the adrenal cortex that are producing the cortisol. And as it says here, that can be due to tuberculosis as one of the causes, as well as sometimes, rarely, cancers growing in this region. The immune system can also attack the cells producing cortisol and even other regions of the adrenal cortex that are producing some other hormones, such as aldosterone. And the lack of aldosterone can lead to problems with imbalances in the electrolytes and water because of the effects of aldosterone on the kidney. This can in turn lead to hypotension, low blood pressure. So the symptoms can be compounded simply by a problem with the production of hormones from the adrenal complex. A physician would label all these symptoms as Addison's disease. Another disease is called Cushing syndrome. This is due to too much cortisol in the blood of the patient, whether they're stressed or not. And the cause may be a primary defect, again with the adrenal tissue itself, or it may be secondary, normally as a result of the hormones that are talking to the adrenal gland themselves being unregulated. So an example here is ACTH secreting tumor in the anterior pituitary gland of that patient. In Cushing's patients, there's an uncontrolled catabolism. Catabolism means breakdown of the bone, skin, and other organs of the patient. Indeed, the different labels that you see here would be applied to the syndrome. And because it's a syndrome, not every patient would have every single one of these, but a combination. The treatment for Cushing's syndrome depends on the cause. It could be the removal of the pituitary tumor, or it could involve cutting and removing parts of the adrenal gland itself. A general shared characteristic of people with Cushing syndrome is a flush face with stretch marks due to excessive weight change. Because stress is a compound condition with many outcomes leading to stress, other hormones may be involved in some types of stress. And indeed, vasopressin, ADH, and aldosterone are also impacted. And they, as we know, are utilized to regulate water and ions within the body, in particular sodium. And any kind of deviation in their concentrations can lead to dehydration, hemorrhage, and sweating. Some forms of stress go on to impact growth hormones, glucagon and insulin, etc., etc. And when they are affected, you can see that the storage amounts of energy can be impacted, as well as the concentrations of glucose that are necessary to feed the cells of the body. Indeed, beta endorphins are generally released in many forms of stress, and they act as painkillers on dulling down some of the painful outcomes of the stress. Stress is more related to activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and that leads to these 5 general changes throughout the entire body. Much research is focused in understanding the components of the various types of stress that a human body can experience. Once we find the answers, we'll have a better solution. Let's move on to growth hormone. Growth hormone is one of many substances in the body that can impact growth. Growth is defined as an increase in the size of cells or an increase in the number of cells in particular regions. This interplay of chemistry can stimulate or curtail growth. When one thinks of growth, we imagine the person is increasing in height. So from that perspective, yes, growth hormone does have an impact on the long bones of the body, those responsible for increasing our height. And they have an effect at not all regions of the bone, primarily here in the epiphyseal plate. So that's the boundary between the shaft and the epiphysis of the bone. Figure 1128 shows a quick relationship from birth until adulthood of the relationship between the size of the brain, that organ, the total body height, and the reproductive organs. We tend to assume that growth of an individual, the height, is related to the genetics of the parents. That's not entirely true, because as we see on this slide, the environment has a major impact on the potential encoded in the genes. So a lack of sufficient nutrients can interfere with the program of growth dictated by the genes. So how many of the hormones in the body can impact growth? Well, the obvious one is growth hormone, but that's only having its action in terms of height at certain periods during our life cycle. But growth hormone has a constant presence in the body, and it can impact us at other times in different ways. We'll see that later. Insulin-like growth factors 1 and 2, which are produced by the liver and endothelial cells, they also have a direct impact on the number of cells in the body and their health. T3 we mentioned earlier, insulin itself, and this insulin has nothing to do with this growth factor. It says insulin-like, it doesn't say it's insulin. And then the sex hormones, naturally, and our friend cortisol is back. In order for our bodies to grow in volume, we need raw material. And that raw material comes in through the diet, as well as energy. So the two commodities necessary for growth are the building blocks of new cells and tissue and energy. Growth hormones take the building blocks, food, and rearrange it in a manner that it promotes the increase in the size of various structures throughout the body. And that relies at the molecular level of the synthesis of new proteins and new muscle and extension of nerves, etc., etc. So it's not surprising that growth hormone impacts your biochemistry very, very directly. But what tells growth hormone when to be released? Well, it has to come from information from other parts of the body. And that interplay is illustrated here in this diagram in the corner. So it's a very complex feedback system that operates to allow us to grow at specific periods of our life cycle. Table 11.5 does a great job of dictating the influence of each type of hormone involved in growth, as well as, of course, the principal actions that take place. So it's worth going through this list and seeing if that agrees with what your perception of growth is. Let's move on to the regulation of a very important mineral, calcium, in the body. We have learned from other chapters that calcium is a very important second messenger. Calcium is also important in muscular contraction. Calcium is also important in nerve function. Calcium, etc., etc., etc. So the importance of calcium throughout the body means that it has to be controlled in terms of its concentration. That concentration must be controlled by something. And those are a number of hormones that interact with other tissues to regulate the body pool of calcium. So any large deviation in the extracellular calcium could be lethal. Any substantial deviation in the extracellular calcium will disrupt many of the activities that we just mentioned, particularly the specialized cells of the nervous system and the contractile units, the muscles. The concentration of calcium is like a mathematical equation. The storage takes place in the bone. Absorption takes place in the GI tract. Excretion takes place via the kidneys. So the coordination of these three locations would impact the amount of calcium in the body, and that's how the system works. Different substances, different hormones interact with these three locations, therefore maintaining a homeostatic relationship with calcium. Bone is mostly calcium, and the way this works is that the space between the cells that make up the bone tissue is mineralized, and calcium is a very important component of that mineralization in the extracellular space. Now, there are two types of bone cell: osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Blasts form bone. Osteoclasts dismantle bone. So they eat away at bone, and they will eventually cut into this layer. Bone itself is under the control of a number of chemicals. So the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts, they respond to different subsets of hormones. So table 11.6 lists the hormones that favor the increase in bone, and it also lists the hormones that favor the opposite, a decrease in the content of bone. We now know that there are two major hormones that control the calcium concentration in the blood, and these are parathyroid hormone, released by the parathyroid glands, which have nothing to do with the thyroid. Para means close to the thyroid. So they just happen to be located at 4 different spots above the thyroid gland. And then there's a form of vitamin D called 1,2-dihydroxy vitamin D, which also has a direct impact on the calcium levels. A third hormone, calcitonin, has a somewhat limited action in humans, but in other primates it has a bigger role. We mentioned the parathyroid glands and their production of parathyroid hormone. That substance, this hormone, is critically important in regulating the calcium levels. So we can see these white spots, there's 4 of them here. These are your parathyroid hormones. The flow chart on figure 1132 does an excellent job in relaying to us how the homeostatic regulation of calcium through this system would be maintained. Remember, this is through this system. There's a multitude of systems, but this system seems to be one of the major ones. So if you followed through, a decrease in calcium level would result in this action, causing this to take place, these actions, and then finally these solutions. So please, flowcharts are very important in this course. With that in mind, this flowchart, figure 1133, shows us how vitamin D in its active form, 1,2-dihydroxy vitamin D, how that influences the absorption of calcium from the GI tract. In the table to do with bone, a few slides back, we looked at something called calcitonin. Calcitonin is a small peptide hormone that happens to be released by the parafollicular cells, which are located in the thyroid gland, but they are distinct from the follicular cells in the thyroid. Calcitonin has the effect of decreasing the concentration of calcium in the blood, and it does so by inhibiting the actions of the osteoclasts. Remember, the osteoclasts are the cells that demineralize bone. They eat bone and they release the contents into the extracellular fluid. So it makes sense that anything that controls their behavior will limit the amount of liberated calcium in the bloodstream. And the roundabout question reappears: what tells the parafollicular cells how much calcitonin to release? And the answer is, well, they must somehow sense the concentration of plasma calcium. So these cells themselves may be some type of sensor cells. The next few slides talk about metabolic bone diseases and other types of diseases manifest by a disturbance in the chemistry of the body. So rickets in children and osteomalacia in adults are conditions where the concentration of mineral in the bone is affected. In both these cases, it's deficient. That causes the bones to become soft and easily bent or fractured. Osteoporosis is an imbalance between bone reabsorption and bone formation. And in this particular set of diagnosis, there's a decrease in bone mass and strength, and that can lead to bone fractures and hip breakages that old people experience upon gentle falls. The bottom of the slide goes on to show us that this can also take place in people that are immobilized because of some medical conditions. The relationship between aging and the sex of the individual are illustrated on this slide. So women tend to suffer more than men do because of menopause. The treatment for osteoporosis includes a combination of these. So the last one is estrogen receptor modulators, which can influence the interaction of this hormone called estrogen in controlling the density of bone. So study this slide, please. Hypercalcemia can also exist, and that's too much calcium in the blood. And again, it can be the result of primary hyperparathyroidism due to a tumor in one of the 4 parathyroid glands, or due to cancers that interfere with the amount of calcium in the blood, or an excessive ingestion of vitamin D. Remember, vitamin D is lipid soluble and it will build up in the body and continue to have an effect on calcium levels. So hypercalcemia symptoms include tiredness, lethargy, and nausea, with vomiting in severe cases. Hypocalcemia, the lack of calcium in the blood, can be due to, again, a number of different causes: primary, pseudo, and secondary. So primary, again, let's guess it, something to do with the thyroid gland? Yes. Pseudo hypoparathyroidism is the result of the resistance of the effects of the hormone, parathyroid hormone, on target tissue, just like insulin in diabetes. And then we have secondary hypoparathyroidism, which is a failure to absorb vitamin D from the intestines or a decreased kidney production of the active form of vitamin D. You can see the symptoms are normally seizures and muscle spasms and neural excitability. So hopefully from this chapter, a number of different patterns have emerged in your understanding of how the body has evolved to regulate other tissues by these long-term messengers. There's a lot more to learn, but as far as the base is concerned, this chapter has done its job. Thank you.